The lunchtime rush at Lou's Retro Diner was in full swing, with the familiar clinking of silverware and the sizzling sound of burgers on the grill filling the air. The diner, with its vintage 50s decor and neon signs, was a favorite hangout for locals and tourists alike. People were seated in booths and at the counter, chatting over milkshakes and sandwiches, as the jukebox softly played old hits in the background. It was an ordinary day, the kind that blended in with the hustle and bustle of city life. But everything changed when he walked in. The door chimed as a man in his late 50s or early 60s entered. His military jacket, decorated with patches and a cap reading U.S. Army, made him stand out among the regular crowd. He wasn't tall, but his posture was straight, carrying the weight of years spent in service. His boots scuffed softly against the tile floor as he moved through the diner, his eyes briefly scanning the room before settling on a seat at the counter. He looked tired, but there was a sense of pride in the way he carried himself. He wasn't seeking attention, but his presence demanded it. He sat down at one of the stools, his movements slow but deliberate. The weariness on his face was obvious as he removed his cap and set it on the counter. He wasn't here for anything special, just a simple meal, a cup of coffee, and a brief moment of peace. He wasn't a man to ask for much. The waitress, a young woman in her early 20s, noticed him immediately. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore the diner's standard blue apron. She walked over to him with a forced smile, though her eyes betrayed her discomfort. There was something about him that made her uneasy. Her politeness felt almost mechanical, as though she had perfected it over years of dealing with customers. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge of nervousness. The veteran, still looking at the menu, took a moment before responding. "Just a cup of coffee and some eggs with toast," he said in a calm, steady voice. There was nothing demanding in his tone, just a quiet request, as if this was nothing more than a casual stop. The waitress scribbled down his order quickly, but her hand trembled slightly. She glanced at him again, her gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary, then turned away to place his order. As she walked back toward the kitchen, she hesitated for a moment at the door. Something about this man, his presence, had unsettled her. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the jacket, the cap, the way he looked out of place here, in this diner that served as a simple escape for everyone else. The other diners went about their meals, oblivious to the tension that had suddenly filled the air. The veteran sat quietly, waiting for his meal, his posture unyielding. He hadn't expected anything extraordinary from this visit, just a moment of normalcy. But outside, the world was about to shift in ways none of them could have predicted. The diner continued to hum, with the usual noise of lunchtime chatter, the clinking of silverware, and the occasional hiss from the kitchen. But the atmosphere had shifted subtly. Malik, the veteran, sat quietly at the counter, his shoulders straight despite the weight of the day and the world pressing down on him. He had ordered his coffee and a simple meal, not expecting anything unusual, just a small break from the noise and rush of city life. But as he waited, his eyes turned toward the door, watching people come and go, oblivious to his presence. He knew better than to draw attention, but something was different about today. The waitress, a young blonde woman in her 20s, had already taken his order with a smile that was as forced as the politeness in her voice. At first, she'd been cordial, but as she made her way back to the kitchen, her steps had slowed. She hesitated for a moment before speaking to the cook, her body language betraying an unease that Malik couldn't ignore. When she returned to him, she stopped short, her eyes flickering over him for a moment too long. She wasn't sure how to approach him now, her movements uncertain. The same forced smile was still on her face, but it was strained, her lips pressed thin as she made her way toward him. "The kitchen's closed for the day," she said abruptly, as if those words were enough to justify what she had just said. "I won't be able to serve you the meal you ordered." Malik blinked, stunned for a moment. He glanced around, seeing that the rest of the diner was still full of customers, some of them in the middle of meals, others waiting for their orders. The kitchen wasn't closed. It couldn't be. He could hear the clatter of plates in the back, the steady rhythm of food being served to everyone else. His disappointment washed over him, but he kept it in check, his voice calm. "Excuse me," he said, trying to keep his composure despite the slight bitterness that had started to build in his chest. "I only ordered coffee. Could you at least serve me that?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she shifted uncomfortably in place, unable to meet his gaze for long. "The kitchen's closed. I can't make exceptions," she replied, her tone flat and cold. It was the kind of tone that came from someone who had already made up their mind, who had decided, without reason, that she wasn't going to serve him. She didn't even offer an apology, just an assumption that he wouldn't argue, that he would simply leave quietly like so many others had. Malik sighed inwardly, but didn't raise his voice. He could feel his chest tighten with frustration, but he had learned long ago that reacting aggressively wasn't going to get him anywhere. He wasn't about to escalate things. "I understand, but could you at least serve me the coffee?" he asked again, a bit softer this time. The veteran was a man of patience, even when his pride was tested. He had faced much worse in his life than this. He could take a bit of disrespect. He just wanted to sit for a moment, sip his coffee, and enjoy a rare moment of peace. The waitress's face grew harder, her discomfort now replaced by irritation. "I'm going to have to call the authorities," she said abruptly, her voice taking on a note of feigned authority. "You're causing trouble in here, and I'm not dealing with it." She stood tall, her hand hovering near the phone on the counter. She was acting as if he had threatened her, as if his quiet request for coffee had turned into an emergency. Malik's eyes narrowed as he processed what she had just said. She was calling the police because he had asked for a cup of coffee. "I'm not causing any trouble," he replied, keeping his voice steady but firm. "I simply asked for what I ordered." But the waitress had already dialed 911, her finger tapping rapidly on the buttons as she continued to speak in a clipped tone. "Yes, we have a man here who is causing problems, refusing to leave after the kitchen closed. I need assistance." Malik couldn't believe what he was hearing. Here he was, a man who had served his country, asking for something as simple as a cup of coffee, and he was being treated like a criminal. A flash of anger threatened to rise within him, but he swallowed it back. He wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. He didn't need to fight. As the phone call continued, he could see the other customers looking over, some of them now watching the scene with a mix of confusion and unease. A few of them shook their heads, glancing back at their meals, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. No one was standing up for him. But what they didn't realize was that this wasn't just about coffee. This was about something deeper, something that had happened long before he had walked into the diner that day. The waitress's prejudice, her decision to treat him like a problem when he had done nothing wrong, was just a reflection of the larger injustices that so many, like him, faced daily. And as the waitress hung up the phone and looked at him, ready for whatever came next, Malik stood tall, not backing down. This moment would define him, but he wouldn't let it break him. The tension in the diner was palpable as the waitress, still holding the phone to her ear, finished dialing 911. She glanced nervously toward the veteran, who remained seated calmly at the counter, his hands folded in front of him. He had not moved or raised his voice, but the unease in the air was evident. The other patrons were either ignoring the scene or pretending not to notice, but the situation had already drawn some attention. Outside, the sirens of a squad car grew louder. The flashing lights reflected through the diner windows, cutting through the otherwise ordinary afternoon. The door opened with a jingle, and two officers walked in, their uniforms crisp and authoritative. The first officer, a tall man with graying hair, scanned the room, his eyes stopping briefly on the waitress, who was standing by the counter looking more tense than she had a moment ago. She quickly motioned to the veteran, her lips tight with anxiety. The second officer, a younger woman, took a step forward, her gaze lingering on the man sitting at the counter. The veteran, dressed in his military jacket, didn't look like someone who would be causing trouble. In fact, he looked more like someone who had seen enough hardship in his life to understand when to stay calm. Still, the officers approached him carefully, their professional demeanor unshaken. "Sir, we received a call about an incident here," the older officer said, his tone measured. "What's going on?" The veteran looked up at the officer with quiet dignity. His voice, though soft, was firm and clear. "I came in for a cup of coffee and something to eat. I've done nothing wrong. I was just sitting here waiting." The older officer nodded, his eyes flicking briefly to the waitress before focusing back on the veteran. "And what did she tell you?" "She told me the kitchen was closed, but I wasn't asking for anything special." "Just coffee," the veteran explained, keeping his composure despite the situation. His voice didn't carry any anger, only the weariness of someone who had been through far worse in his life. The waitress stood silently, wringing her hands in front of her. She had called the authorities, and now the situation was in their hands. Her earlier bravado seemed to evaporate as the officers turned to her for an explanation. He wouldn't leave," she said hesitantly, glancing at the veteran, then quickly away. "I told him the kitchen was closed, and he insisted on being served. I felt uncomfortable, so I called for help." The older officer nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You called 911 because he asked for coffee?" he asked, his voice now tinged with disbelief. The younger officer, who had been listening intently, seemed to pause as she looked at the veteran more closely. A flicker of recognition crossed her face as her gaze softened. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're the veteran who was honored last year, aren't you?" The veteran simply nodded, his face still calm, but his eyes holding something deeper, a story untold. The younger officer's demeanor shifted. She glanced at her partner, who was now processing the situation, and then turned to the waitress, her face showing a mix of empathy and confusion. "This man is a veteran. He served our country. He's asking for a cup of coffee. We don't need to escalate this any further," she said firmly, her voice carrying a tone of finality. The older officer, now understanding the situation more clearly, turned to the veteran. "We apologize for the confusion, sir. We'll make sure this is handled properly. You can go about your day, and we'll take care of the rest." The veteran, despite his frustrations, simply nodded once more, his shoulders still stiff, but his posture relaxed. He hadn't asked for an apology. He hadn't demanded anything. He simply wanted the respect he was due, and now it was clear he was going to get it, though at a cost he hadn't expected. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension slowly lifting as the officers, after a final glance at the waitress, made their way toward the door. As they left, the customers who had been watching the whole ordeal seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats. They had seen the exchange, the prejudice in action, but most of them had been too afraid or indifferent to speak up. The veteran's calm had been his weapon in this moment. His steady composure had forced the situation to its resolution. The waitress stood by the counter, her face pale and her hands trembling. She had expected this moment to play out differently. She had expected him to leave, or perhaps to make a scene. But instead, she had learned a hard lesson, one that she wouldn't forget any time soon. As the veteran sipped his coffee, now unbothered, she couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if she had acted with kindness and understanding from the start. The tension in the diner had finally begun to ease as the officers made their way toward the door. But just as the veteran was about to return to his seat, the older officer turned back, his gaze fixing on the waitress. He took a step toward her, his voice steady, but filled with respect. "Ma'am," the officer began, his eyes never leaving the waitress, "I think there's something you should know." His tone shifted, a sense of gravity in his words. "This man, the one you just called the authorities on, he's not just anyone. He's a respected member of this community, a war hero." The waitress's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat as the weight of his words hit her. The officer continued, his voice softening but filled with pride. "He served with distinction in multiple conflicts. We were in the same unit, actually. I've seen firsthand what kind of man he is, a man who gave everything for this country, for all of us. And what you just did?" He shook his head, his disappointment evident. "You didn't just serve him poorly, you insulted him, and you insulted the sacrifices he made." The waitress stood frozen, her mouth dry, the color draining from her face as she processed the officer's words. She had been so quick to judge, so quick to dismiss him because of his appearance. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just any random man she had ignored. He was a hero, a man who had fought for the freedoms she took for granted. Her hands trembled, and she stepped back slightly, the weight of her actions sinking in. She had discriminated against someone who had served his country with honor, someone whose dignity was hard-earned, yet she had treated him like a second-class citizen. The veteran, however, remained composed, his face still calm. He turned to the waitress, his voice steady as he spoke, not with bitterness, but with quiet grace. "I didn't want any trouble," he said softly. "I just wanted a simple meal, to sit down and have a moment of peace. But I understand. I've been treated this way before. It's disheartening, but I hold no grudge against you." His words, filled with poise and dignity, carried a weight that made the air in the diner feel thick. The veteran's calmness in the face of this injustice left the room silent. The waitress stood there, speechless, realizing she had just been schooled by a man who had seen the worst of the world and still carried himself with honor. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted from tension to a quiet, heavy silence. The waitress stood there, her body tense, her mind racing as the reality of the situation dawned on her. She had just discriminated against a war hero, someone who had served this country with honor, and now the weight of her actions was settling on her shoulders. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a step toward the veteran, her face pale, her voice shaky with remorse. I'm so sorry," she began, her words coming out in a rush. "I didn't mean to. I was wrong. I acted out of prejudice, and I didn't see you for who you are. Just..." Just someone I didn't expect to be here. I was rude, and I shouldn't have treated you like that." She looked down at the floor, her embarrassment clear. "I was wrong, and I can't undo it, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry." The veteran, who had sat calmly through the entire ordeal, looked up at her. His gaze was not one of anger or judgment, but of quiet understanding. With a deep breath, he met her eyes, his voice steady and kind. "We all make mistakes," he said, his tone measured but filled with a wisdom that came from years of experience. "What matters is what you do after. It's not enough to just do the job. You have to show kindness, respect, and understanding to everyone you meet. And that means seeing people for who they truly are, not just their appearance or their circumstances." His words hung in the air, weighty and powerful. He paused for a moment before continuing, his eyes never leaving her face. "Every person deserves respect, no matter their background or what they look like. We all have stories we carry with us. Some are more visible than others, but that doesn't make anyone less worthy of kindness." The officers, who had been standing off to the side watching the exchange, stepped forward. The older officer, the one who had spoken earlier, placed a hand gently on the waitress's shoulder. "He's right," he said, his voice firm but kind. "No one should ever be judged by the color of their skin or the uniform they wear. Respect is something we all owe each other, regardless of who we are or where we come from. It's what makes us human." The younger officer, who had recognized the veteran earlier, nodded in agreement. "This is a lesson we all need to remember," she added. "And it starts with understanding that kindness is something we can choose every day." The waitress, still visibly distressed, nodded slowly, her eyes filling with gratitude for the words of the officers. She turned back to the veteran, her voice quieter but sincere. "Thank you," she said, almost in a whisper. "I know I can't change what happened, but I promise I'll do better. I'll remember this." The veteran nodded once, offering her a small, reassuring smile. "I believe you will," he said simply. The atmosphere in Lou's Retro Diner shifted almost immediately after the exchange between the waitress and the veteran. The tension that had once clouded the room began to dissolve, replaced by a collective realization that something important had just happened. The once quiet murmurs of disbelief among the patrons grew into supportive conversations. People who had once ignored the scene or remained silent now seemed to look at the situation with fresh eyes. A couple of customers, who had been sitting in a booth near the counter, exchanged glances before one of them stood up. He made his way over to the veteran's table, extending a hand with a respectful smile. "Sir," he said, his voice warm, "I just wanted to thank you for your service. You're a hero, and I didn't realize what was going on here until now." The veteran, though clearly still processing the events, shook the man's hand firmly. His face softened as he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Thank you, but I'm not looking for any recognition. Just doing my part, like anyone else." The man nodded, understanding. "You deserve more than that. It's an honor to shake your hand." One by one, other customers followed suit, making their way to the veteran's table, offering handshakes or quiet words of respect. The room, once filled with discomfort, had now transformed into something different, something hopeful. The veteran, who had come in expecting nothing more than a simple meal, was now the center of a quiet, yet profound moment of recognition. The waitress, standing by the counter, watched this shift in the diner, her heart heavy with reflection. She had acted in a way that she regretted, and the weight of that was not lost on her. She had thought she was in the right, but now, seeing the respect people were showing the veteran, she realized just how wrong she had been. Her posture had shifted. No longer defensive, she stood a little taller, her face flushed with humility. Taking a deep breath, she walked slowly toward the veteran's table. He had seen her earlier, his eyes calm but firm, as she tried to explain her actions. She didn't know if he would even want to speak to her again, but something in her heart told her she needed to try. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, standing by his table. The veteran looked up at her, his face still calm, but with a softness in his eyes that made her feel a little less nervous. "I just wanted to apologize again," she continued, her voice sincere. "I treated you unfairly, and I acted out of ignorance. I see that now. If you're willing to let me, I'd like to serve you the meal you asked for, this time with kindness." The veteran's expression softened even more, and he smiled, a smile that seemed to carry the weight of everything he had experienced in his life: hardship, struggle, and grace. "That's all I needed," he said, his voice gentle. "Just a little kindness. That's all anyone needs." The waitress nodded, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said, her words filled with gratitude. "I'll be right back with your meal." As she walked away to the kitchen, the veteran sat back, looking out over the diner. The other patrons were still talking quietly, some still casting glances toward him, but all with newfound respect. The room, once filled with judgment and tension, had become a place of reflection, a place where change was beginning, even if it was just in small ways. When the waitress returned, she brought the veteran's meal with a genuine smile, placing it before him with care. This time, there was no hesitation, no forced politeness. She had learned something in those brief moments of reflection, something she would carry with her. The veteran's smile, warm and appreciative, confirmed that perhaps this was the real service he had needed all along. The veteran ate his meal slowly, savoring each bite as the waitress checked on him periodically, offering refills and making sure everything was just right. There was no rush, no tension. The diner had shifted, just like the people in it. And as the veteran finished his meal, surrounded by quiet moments of growth, he couldn't help but feel that, in some small way, the world had become just a bit kinder.